As a young person, I know that you've thought about who might be here. And as I stated a moment ago, hey, maybe you've got a crush on somebody, and you're in hopes that they will be here at this great meeting. And you get here early, you come in, you get a seat, and you're sitting there waiting for services to begin, and somebody comes by and leans down and says to you, "He's here." And your heart jumps. Oh, you're excited, and you're filled with anticipation. But suppose somebody comes in, and you don't know who they are, you have no background with them whatsoever, and somebody leans over and tells you that so-and-so has just walked in. Well, it doesn't mean anything to you because you don't have any connection. But suppose somebody comes in that is objectionable to you. I mean, maybe it's somebody that has seemingly devoted their life to trying to make your life miserable. And somebody comes by and leans over and whispers in your ear, "He's here." Your heart sinks, and you're just thinking to yourself, "I wish I could be anywhere else." Well, I've got a hunch that was the way that King Ahab felt when King Ahab received word from one of his men that Elijah was here. He didn't want to hear that because Elijah was the last man he wanted to see. And he knew that if Elijah was there, that Elijah's God, with his power in his presence, would be there as well. And so for a little while this evening, I want to talk about Elijah is here and what that means to us. Elijah undoubtedly was one of the greatest men of the Bible. And he comes upon the stage like a bolt of lightning out of the blue. We don't know very much about him. Don't know anything about his parents or about his early life. But he single-handedly worked a national revolution and turned the whole nation of Israel back to God. And then when it came time for him to depart this life, he departed just as sensationally as he arrived. In fact, his departure is even more sensational than his coming. Jesus says that no man greater than John the Baptist had been born. And yet the measurement for John the Baptist is Elijah. Jesus said that John did his work in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And there are many similarities between the two men. They wore the same kind of clothes. Elijah was a hairy man and wore a girdle of leather. John was clothed in camel's hair and wore a skin girdle around his midsection. Elijah and John were both schooled in the desert. They were both the sons of solitude. Both had to proclaim messages of judgment and denunciation. Both were courageous. Elijah denounced wicked King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. John denounced King Herod and his wicked wife Herodias. Both were pursued by the hatred of a wicked woman. Jezebel pursued and hated Elijah. Herodias hated John the Baptist. And both men suffered low points in faith during their lives. When Elijah fell beneath the juniper tree and begged for God to come and take his life because he'd rather die than to face the wrath of the wicked Jezebel. And Elijah, John the Baptist, when he was in prison, he sent word to the Lord and said, "Now, are you the one, or should we be looking for somebody else?" The highest tribute paid Elijah, however, is when Jesus appeared here upon this earth. And you remember about 6 months before he died, he took Peter, James, and John high up on a mountain, and he transfigured himself. And just prior to that, you'll recall that Jesus, he had about 6 months to go, been here about 2.5 to 3 years. And he took his disciples off up in the region of Caesarea Philippi, and there for the first time, he questioned them specifically about his identity. He said, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And one of them said, "Well, some people think you're Elijah." Why in the world would anybody think that Jesus was Elijah? I'll tell you why. Because in Malachi 4 and verse 5, there the prophet said, God says through the prophet, behold, I send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And so 400 years after Elijah departed this earth, the prophet Malachi says that Elijah would return and before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And when Jesus appeared upon the earth, he preached his sermons, his parables, gave his judgments, did his healing works. There were those who thought that he was the fulfillment of the prophecy. Well, of course, Jesus explained to his disciples that this prophecy was fulfilled in John the Baptist, who came and did his work in the power and the spirit of Elijah. But did you know that since Malachi made that prophecy, there have been Jews every year that when the Passover rolls around, which corresponds with what most people call Easter season, when the Jews observe Passover, certain of the Jews, when they prepare the Passover meal, they will set an extra place setting at the table just in case Elijah returns on that occasion. And could you imagine the thrill of being able to get in touch with your extended family and friends and declare to them, Elijah is here? If they're still looking for that to this day. Well, he did come back. Now, I started to mention this a moment ago, 800 years after his departure on the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus took Peter, James, and John high up on a mountain, and he transfigured himself, gave them a glimpse of his glorious nature. And who appeared upon the scene but Moses, who had been dead for 1,300 years, and Elijah, who had been gone for 800 years. And Luke says in Luke 9 that they spoke to Jesus about his death that would be accomplished in Jerusalem. And so, if on the Mount of Transfiguration Jesus found it profitable to speak with Elijah, it should be profitable for us to take a look at this magnificent character tonight. What should it mean to us tonight when we hear Elijah is here? Well, for one thing, it should remind us that God's eyes are on the wicked and that they shall not go unpunished. I'm going to give you 3 brief examples of this. The first judgment that God pronounced upon King Ahab and Israel was a great drought. Israel at this time was in apostasy, and King Ahab, urged by his heathen wife Jezebel, who was a worshiper of Baal, had led the nation down the dark and wicked path of idolatry. I mean, there were temples of Baal in Jezreel and in Samaria, and the worship of God Jehovah had all but been overthrown in the land. The surviving prophets of God had fled, and they were hiding in the caves of the hills. And so Elijah makes his first sudden and dramatic appearance before King Ahab. According to 1 Kings 17 and verse 1, and it says, as the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall be no dew nor rain these years, but according to my works. Can you imagine what it would be like today if we had no rain? No rain. One of my favorite authors is the late Elmer Kelton. And one of the best books that he ever wrote is titled, The Time It Never Rained. It is based on a true story about a drought that took place in West Texas back in the 1950s. I've had Texans tell me, well, big deal. Texas is always under drought. The late Art Eastman, who lived in Midland, Texas, told me one time, he said, Midland gets 6 inches of rain every year, but he said it can be kind of tough if you happen to be there the day it comes. Well, it was always a time of drought. You know, it was a drought that lasted 6 years. Can you imagine? It did not rain for 6 years. Cattle ranchers were devastated. They lost all their cattle. Some of them resorted to goat raising because goats could live on less and you could sell their hair. Well, it must have been like that for Israel when God pronounced the drought upon King Ahab and the people of God at that time. Well, Elijah vanishes, and this drought lasted 3.5 years. But after 3.5 years, God decided to end the drought. He sends Elijah back to Samaria to tell King Ahab about it. And you can read about it in 1 Kings, the 18th chapter, verse 17. 3 years before, he sent him in to announce the drought. Now he's sending him in to say that the drought has come to an end. And the Bible tells us that he got to Samaria and he saw one of King Ahab's men, and he told him, he said, I've got to see Ahab. And that was a message that he didn't want to hear. Ahab was the last man he wanted to see. But nonetheless, he found King Ahab and he said, Elijah is here and he wants to see you. And Ahab went to see Elijah, according to 1 Kings 18 and verse 17, and he says, is that you, you troubler of Israel? And that word troubler is sometimes translated snake. And to put that in our vernacular, he was saying, you sorry snake in the grass, is that you? You have troubled Israel? And Elijah said, I'm not the trouble for Israel. He said, you're the one that's caused the trouble for Israel. And he said, I want you to get all your 450 prophets of Baal together and all the people, and I want you to come to Mount Carmel. And they did. And I don't suppose there was an assembly like that of God's people since the days of Joshua, when Joshua made the successful conquest of Canaan and gathered the people together and told them, choose this day whom you will serve, the God of Israel or the heathen gods that their fathers served on the other side of the flood. Well, Elijah challenges the people of God here in a very similar way. He says, how long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. And of course, this is one of the most decisive moments in Israel's history. Elijah challenges the 450 prophets of Baal. He says, I want you to build an altar to Baal. I want you to put a sacrifice upon it, and then I want you to pray to Baal to send down rain, to send down fire to consume the sacrifice. And they tried and they failed. Well, he built an altar to Jehovah. He put wood upon the altar. He put a sacrifice upon the altar. And then he dug a trench around the altar, and he poured 12 barrels of water over all of the altar. The sacrifice filled up the trench with water. And then he stepped back and he prayed, hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. And fire fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifice, the altar, the rocks, the water, licked up the water that was in the trench. The children of Israel's eyes were on stems, and they cried out, Jehovah is God. Jehovah is God. And Elijah said, get those 450 prophets, don't let them get away. And he executed every one of them. And you may be thinking, well, wasn't that extreme? I mean, wasn't that radical? Wasn't that an overreaction? Suppose the doctor told you today that they had discovered a rapidly growing mass of cancer in your abdomen. And he said, I think we might ought to do a little exploratory surgery and go in there and get some of those cells out. Is that what you'd want to hear? No. You would want to hear him say, hey, we need to go in there and get all of that. Get all of the cancerous cells and leave a clean border around where it was so it cannot spread. That's what you'd want to hear. And that would not be radical. That would be essential. And of course, the prophets of Baal, they were an immoral, hostile, anti-God malignancy in the land of Israel. And Elijah knew that he had to cut away the infection of such a godless menace. And that illustrates that God's eyes are on the wicked and they shall not go unpunished. I want to give you one other example. 1 Kings 21, the familiar story of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth had a vineyard that had joined the palace property, and this is something that King Ahab coveted. Oh, he wanted that vineyard. And so he went to Naboth and asked to purchase it, but Naboth didn't want to sell. There's not a thing in the world wrong with that. I mean, if you want a piece of property, you go to the owner, you offer to pay a fair price. That's just a legitimate business deal. But Naboth didn't want to sell. King Ahab went back to his palace, went to his room, and lay across the bed with his face to the wall and pouted like a child. And Jezebel, his wife, came in and said, "What's the trouble?" Now, she was the real man in the palace. And he told her what the problem was, and she said, "Don't worry about it, I'll take care of it." And she did. She accused Naboth of violating the law and sentenced him to death. And he was stoned to death near the pool of Samaria, and the scavenger dogs gathered around him and licked up his blood that flowed from his mangled body. Elijah heard about it. And you know what? In the next breath, Elijah is here again. And he tells Ahab, because of his wicked deed, he said, God is going to take your life, you're going to die, and the scavenger dogs are going to lick your blood in the same spot that they licked the blood of Naboth. Days passed, weeks passed, months passed, years passed, and no doubt Ahab thought to himself, well, the old prophet missed this one. Hey, he misfired on this one. But the truth of the matter is, you remember, he was going to war against the Syrians, and he was fatally wounded. They rushed back to Samaria, and he died. They drug his body out of his chariot near the pool of Samaria, and they washed his blood out on the ground, and the scavenger dogs came and licked his blood from exactly the same spot that they had licked the blood of Naboth. Once again, the eyes of God are on the wicked, and they shall not go unpunished. But now at the same time, when we hear Elijah is here, we should also be made to remember that God's eyes are on the faithful, and that God gives comfort and help in time of trouble. I'll give you 3 examples of this in the life of Elijah. After that first appearance to King Ahab and the announcement of the drought, he disappeared. God told him to hide himself in the wilderness, and he took him to a remote valley near the Cherith Brook. And during the great drought, he drank from the Cherith Brook, and God fed him by sending him food by way of the ravens. Now, he did that to prepare him for future work by teaching him to depend upon God. And how could you better teach somebody to depend upon God than to feed them by having ravens bring them their food? Another example, the brook dried up because of the drought. And so God directed Elijah to the coast, into the house of a poor widow woman. She was starving, and Elijah told her he wanted some bread and water. And she responded by saying, I've got a handful of meal, and I'm getting ready to go find enough sticks to build a fire, and I'm going to make some bread. My son and I are going to eat it, and we're going to die. And that's who God selected to take care of and sustain the prophet. How true the words are in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 27, God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. But then one other example. After this seemingly impressive victory at Mount Carmel, there was one person who was not impressed, and that was Queen Jezebel. And when she heard the 450 prophets of Baal had been slain, she put out a contract on the life of Elijah and sent word to him saying that tomorrow at this time you're going to be a dead man. And Elijah was terrified. Now he thought he'd just won a great battle that his forefathers didn't win. He thought he had just overthrown idolatry there at Mount Carmel. He had gone toe-to-toe with King Ahab. But when this wicked woman threatens his life, he runs like a chicken in a storm. He's terrified. He runs a day's journey. He falls under a tree and he begs God to take his life. He'd rather die than to have to face the wrath of Jezebel. Well, subsequently, he ends up hiding in a cave. And this always, I think about what James has to say about this in James 5 and verse 17. He said Elijah was a man with a nature just like ours. He was flesh and blood, muscle and bone. He got really discouraged. He had some huge disappointments. He had faults and failures and doubts. He was just a man. He was physically and emotionally exhausted. He was lost in self-pity, and exhaustion will lie to you. Exhaustion will exaggerate the situation. It will drive you to tears. He had lost sight of God, and his focus was upon himself. I think about Elijah under these circumstances and what James says about him. And then I also recall that low point in John the Baptist's faith when he sent word while he was in prison, waiting to be executed. He sent word to the Lord and said, hey, are you the one, or should we be looking for somebody else? And when I think about such great men as these having moments, low moments in their faith, then it shouldn't be too surprising when you and I are depressed and almost in despair for the same reasons. I mean, there are many today who are perplexed, confused, and disheartened because of the iniquity that has come upon us like a flood, and we're tempted to ask, what have we accomplished? The vast majority of the world doesn't seem to be interested in anything we've got to say. But on those occasions, we've got to remember that God has not abdicated the throne, that God is not dead. I want you to notice what he does for Elijah. First thing he does, he gets Elijah's, he gets to the root of the problem. He identifies the problem. He gets Elijah's focus off of himself and back on God. And he does that by virtue of appearing to him in a still, small voice while Elijah was hiding in a cave. Get him focused back upon God rather than upon himself. Many years ago, there was a man in a veterans hospital that suffered a series of heart attacks. He had undergone major surgery, and during his rehabilitation, he had to stay in what was a dismal veterans hospital. He had a young boy, and while he was confined to the hospital, he made a little wooden truck for his boy. And the boy was not allowed to go up to the ward and visit his father. So when the man finished the truck, he asked the orderly if he'd be willing to take it down to the parking lot where his wife would be and where the little boy would be with her. And the orderly said, well, sure, I'd be glad to do it. So the man finished it. He got it all wrapped up in wrapping paper and gave it to the orderly. He took it out, and then he watched from the 5th floor window what took place down in the parking lot. The orderly got down there, and he walked over to the woman and the little boy and handed the little boy the gift. And the little boy's eyes got big, and he took it, and he ripped into the wrapping, and he saw the little toy wooden truck, and he just squealed. He hugged it to his heart, and he said, oh, thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. And he ran and hugged the orderly. And the father's up there in the 5th story window, waving his arms, trying to get the little boy's attention and trying to get him to see that it was me. I did it. I'm the one that sent you the little truck. And finally, the mother and the orderly got the little boy calmed down, and they explained to him and turned him around and pointed up to the 5th floor window to his father. And the little boy looked up and he hugged it to his heart, and he said, "Oh, Daddy, thank you. Thank you. I love it. I love you. I hope you'll come home soon." And all the father could do was just watch with tears streaming down his cheeks. How much are we like that little boy? We shut ourselves away in a cave of loneliness and discouragement, and God sends gifts our way of rest and refreshment, wise counsel, close personal friends, and we love the gifts, but sometimes we fail to acknowledge the giver. We need to look up and acknowledge the giver more than the gifts. Thank God for telling us about Elijah, who is an unforgettable example that there's nowhere to look but up. And so that was the first step. He identified the problem, and he got him refocused off of himself and back on God. Next, he gives him rest and refreshment. Next, he gives him exercise. He tells him to go to Damascus and Israel and anoint a couple of kings. And then next, he gives him a close friend, a support person, Elisha. Did you know that Elijah had never had a friend? Not one close friend in his entire life. And so God gives him one in the person of Elisha. Now that's amazing to me. I will confess to you tonight that back in 1986, I went through a period of depression. I didn't know it. In fact, I was the last one to know it. But I did. I knew that I didn't feel well. I was tired all the time. I would go to bed exhausted at night, and I'd get up the next morning. I was tireder when I got up than I was when I went to bed. I had trouble concentrating. I'd try to read, I'd try to study, and it was a chore. I began to have problems with my vision, and I got to worrying that maybe I'd contracted diabetes. I know those are symptoms of diabetes. And so finally I went to the doctor. Boy, he put me through a battery of tests, and he called me in, and he said, "Carl, there's not a thing in the world wrong with you physically." He said, "Your problem is stress." He said, "You can only absorb so many units of stress over a short period of time until something's got to give." Well, my father died in February of that year. My father and I were very close. My mother was in the early stages of dementia. And when my father died, we learned that her dementia was much worse than we had known. I had to put a new roof on my house, and the insurance company helped, but not nearly enough. I had to buy a new van that I could not afford, but I had to do it because my old one gave up the ghost. So I went in debt up to my eyeballs and bought another one. And it was then that I began to have problems. As I say, I was tired all the time. And I said, "Okay, you've identified the problem." I said, "What are we going to do about it?" He said, "Well, the first step is identifying the problem." And we've done that. He said, "Now the second step, you got to get some rest and some refreshment." He said, "I want you to cancel your meetings for the rest of the year." This was in May, I think it was, and I had a full schedule through November. I like to have a heart attack when he told me that. I said, "Man, I can't do that." And I did cancel one. I canceled Ash Camp, West Virginia, but I didn't cancel any of the rest of them. But he said, you need to streamline your life somewhat. And I did try to do some of that. And then he said, you need to get some regular exercise. And so I started jogging and walking again and have tried to keep that practice up as a lifelong lifestyle. He said, give it some time. And then he said, you find a support person that you can talk to, somebody that you trust, that you love, that you have confidence in, and you feel like you can tell them anything that you want to tell them. And you know, I look back over that tonight, and it looks to me like he ripped that page right out of the great physician's book. He also showed me something that he called the Holmes Rahe Life Stress Inventory. And on one side of the page, there's 43 or 44 life events, 43 life events. And then on the opposite side of the page, there are the average units of stress that they normally produce. Number one on the list is the death of a spouse. And that usually results in about 100 units of stress. Divorce is number two, about 73 units of stress. The death of a close family member, 63 units of stress, and it goes on down. And then after you get through with the inventory, it gives you the results. And that is that if you scored 150 points or below, you're probably not going to have any problems physically because that's pretty normal. But if you score between 150 to 300 points, then there's a 50% chance of a major health breakdown over the next 2 years. And if you score 300 or more, there was an 80% chance of a major health breakdown over the next 2 years. And he said, that's where you are. Well, the remedy, as I said, sounds so similar to what the great physician had for Elijah. He identified the problem, told him to take rest and refreshment, gave him some exercise, sent him to Damascus and Israel to anoint a couple of kings, and then he gave him a close personal friend for support. And that should remind us this evening when we hear Elijah is here, not only that God's eyes are upon the wicked and they shall not escape, but also God's wise eyes are upon the faithful, and he gives comfort and help to those who are in need. One other point I want to make this evening, and that is the certainty and the glory of the life to come. I stated a moment ago that Elijah was a lonely man, wanted to be alone all of his life. And you know, when it came time for him to leave this world, he wanted to be alone again. He told Elisha to leave him. He wanted to be alone, but Elisha wouldn't have it. And you'll recall they were walking together. They came to the river Jordan, and Elijah took off his mantle, his cloak, and he rolled it up, and he struck the water of the river Jordan. The waters parted. And the two of them walked across on dry ground to the other side. And they were walking along together talking, and suddenly a chariot and horses of fire swooped down out of heaven and swooped him up and carried him to heaven in a whirlwind. Now, you talk about an exit. That was an exit. And that sublime ending to Elijah's earthly life, I think it's a magnificent testimony to the truth that good men never really die, but that death cannot conquer them, and that they have a high and exceedingly great reward in heaven. In conclusion tonight, the Lord said in Matthew 8 and verse 11 that we shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Can you imagine that? And we will be surrounded by its indescribable splendors and beauties. And while we are associating with these illustrious citizens, Undoubtedly, we'll hear somebody say to another, behold, Samuel is here. Maybe we'll hear somebody say, behold, David is here. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, John the Baptist, Peter, John, Paul are here. And it's very probable that we'll hear somebody say, behold, Elijah is here. And maybe we'll have the opportunity to talk to him about what he and Moses talked with the Lord about on the Mount of Transfiguration. But you know what I want to hear more than anything else? I want to hear somebody say, hey, Carl's here. And you want to hear your name called as well.